This is Swim, Success with Music. Hey, what's going on, everybody? This is Swim, Success with Music. I am Walt. I am your music coach. And again, this is Success with Music. This is the Swim Podcast, a podcast for singers, songwriters, beat makers, musicians, music students. You know how we do. It is all about that music life, and I appreciate you checking back in with us today. And if you happen to be joining us for the first time, know that you are listening to part 2 of a series that we're doing for compression. So to make sure that you're not lost, make sure that you go back to episode 44, which is just the previous episode on compression, as we're going to continue on and build from the thoughts that we presented in the previous episode. So again, if you're brand new to the show, make sure you go back to episode 44, and then you can pick up with today's episode, which is episode 45, part 2 of our compression series. All right, so in the previous episode, we got into a discussion on threshold, and we also got into ratios, how to use ratio for your compressor. For today, however, we're going to push forward and get through the remaining building blocks that most compressors have, and that will be attack, release, and gain. All right, so let's go ahead and get into the show. But as we do, I want to give you a few final thoughts about ratios, kind of doing the piggyback thing off of the previous episode, moving into our final points that I just mentioned. Yo, let's get it. I will say this about ratios, though. If your ratio goes up very, very high, I'm going to bring your mind back to that diagonal line. When you increase your ratio a lot, you will find that at the point of your threshold, the line will start to take on more of a horizontal path in your digital audio workstation. So again, if you're using that plugin, you'll see the threshold point, and if you turn your ratio really high, you'll find that that line just plateaus. And what that means is that it is making kind of a sharp turn and saying that it will not allow sound to go beyond a certain point, and it's doing it in a very, very aggressive way. And to be direct with you guys, if you're following with me thus far, it starts to sound squished. It does not allow for breathing. It doesn't allow for the track to breathe. It doesn't sound natural. And that's another thing about compression, of which we'll talk about here in just a moment. All right, let's move on to our next point here, because I think I spent way too much time on that, though the ratio is a major part of compression. All right, the next thing is attack. Attack deals with how long before that sound is subject to volume reduction once it reaches the threshold point. So for instance, if you're playing a sound, let's say, let's go back to that 12 decibel threshold point. Let's say I hit my snare drum and the volume really goes up to, let's say, close to, 2 decibels. The attack setting will cue my compressor to yank that sound down after a certain amount of time. If you set your attack at 0, it's going to happen the moment it hits the negative 12 threshold. Or if you, let's say, move it up a bit to, 2 milliseconds, it will take 2 milliseconds, and then it will yank it back down to whatever ratio that you have. So in other words, increasing your attack will give things crossing the threshold just a little breathing room, just a little space to kind of correct and drop back down to that ratio that you have set. So with the right attack setting, you can have a more natural sound. But if you use too much attack, you pretty much allow the sound to run rampant. And if it takes a long time for it to get under the control of the compressor, then there's no point in using the compressor. So the attack, again, just deals with how much time is allotted before the compression actually kicks in on a certain sound crossing the threshold point. All right, let's move on to our next one here. And the next one is release. Some people see released as the polar opposite of attack. See release as the setting that allows your volume to go back to its untampered original state. So in other words, the release will basically release that sound that we compressed initially. It basically frees it back up again to go back to its natural state, whatever that happens to be. In many instances, release should be fairly short. And the reason for that is if you don't make the release time fairly short, then it creates this throbbing in volume and it can feel just very weird and make you kind of feel spacey while you're listening to a track that has a lot of dynamics. So again, release is all about the setting that frees your volume to go back to its original state. All right. And the last one here is gain. Gain is pretty simple. It's just the overall volume of your compressor. So in your compression plugin, you may see in and out. You may see meters or indicators that will tell you about the sound that's coming into your compression and the sound that's going out of your compression. Well, if you take your gain and move it up, it will take your gain, your volume coming into the compression and move it way up. If you're compressing your music or vocals, the thing is your overall volume can go down because you are actually shaving off some of the energy at the threshold point. As a result, that entire piece can get a little lower in volume. Well, gain can push things up. You can actually use gain to push up the lower parts of the music or the phrase or the musical phrase or the line of lyrics. And at the top side of that, using your threshold, you can squish down the parts that go beyond a certain point. So in other words, it's like bringing up the valley and then kind of pushing down the mountains just a bit, if you can follow my illustration, and it creates more of a flatter surface or more uniform surface. So if you can kind of picture that, that's what's happening when it comes to using your gain. All right, so let me give you a few more thoughts about compression, and then I'm going to go ahead and jump into playing a couple of audio clips and play around with the compression and tell you what's happening. And now that you know what the 5 major parts are, you can tune your ear into what I'm going to be doing in just a few moments here. All right, so here are my thoughts about compression overall. Number 1, too much compression will drain the life out of your project. Again, it's a phenomenal tool to use to even things out. But if you even things out to the point where it's sounding squished, if you're using very high ratios, you take the life out of music. I don't think that's a good thing. There's a debate in music depending on, what era that you've grown up in or what type of music you like. But I can tell you that some of the more modern eras are there. A lot of the music is heavily compressed. And most times that's done to really pump up the overall volume of a track to make it as loud as possible without going over a certain threshold. So if you use it too much, I believe that it drains your music of its life. Now, that may not be of concern of yours if you're using music or if you're creating music that's more digital in nature. Digital by definition is not natural, right? But if you're going with more of an acoustic set, you're doing some jazz, or maybe you're doing some, vocal related things, or, a cappella related things, you may not want to smash things a lot with your compression because it will start to take away from the natural instrumentation and the natural flow with volume and things like that and dynamics. All right. Next thought about compression. I would say only add it when necessary. Don't just automatically assume that, hey, I'm making a track, I must add compression. No, only use it when you have volume that is just a bit out of control, meaning where your peaks and your valleys in your audio clips, that they're very, very far apart. That's when you want to bring compression in. So if you record a vocal segment and your P's or your T's, as you're singing them, they're popping really loud. And then the rest of the phrases on your audio clip, they look very low on your screen. That may be a time to use compression. But if things are uniform and you're looking at your audio meter and it's kind of bouncing around and green around the same area, there may be no real reason to use compression. So again, use it when necessary. And final thing here, if you're using compression on your master bus, make sure that you don't use it in an extreme way. Again, I know that some people use a compression specifically for mastering. I use it all the time. I'm going to play a track for you here in just a moment where I've used compression and it's worked out pretty well. But if you over compress all the work and all the time that you spent singing, mixing and recording, you could ruin your entire track by at the very end over compressing. All right, let's go ahead and jump into a few musical examples. Let's do this. I'm going to set my compression. I'm going to do some extreme numbers here again, just to drive home the point. So I'm going to set my threshold at negative 25 decibels. That's pretty low. And then I'm going to set my ratio at 20-1, which is crazy high. So let's translate this. I'm saying to my compressor, hey, at negative 25 decibels, which is pretty quiet, I want you to severely limit or reduce anything that goes beyond negative 25 decibels. I want you to reduce it by a factor of 20-1. And then I'll let it play through once. And on the loop, I'm going to bypass it to go back to the normal state. So you can hear the difference in the compression. I left my metronome on here so you can hear that is remaining the same while the sound behind the metronome, the guitar, is being changed a lot. Here's the compressed version, and then listen for the uncompressed version when we loop it. Here we go. Okay, so you heard that, right? There was a substantial reduction using the compression. So what's happening here? The compression, again, is dealing with volume. I'm saying, hey, at negative 25 decibels, which is pretty low, once my sound gets up to that point, yank it down. And yank it down by a factor of 20-1. So what that does, again, it gives me more of a horizontal line as opposed to a diagonal line. So it kind of shaves the sound off after 25 decibels. So it's just reduced substantially. Okay, let's bring this back to a normal place or state. Let me go up to, I think, negative 18 decibels would make sense for this guitar. And I'm going to use a ratio of about 4 here. I think that may be a lot better than that extreme compression that I was using. And beyond that, my attack here, I'm going to put it at 10 milliseconds. And my release, I'm going to set it at 50 milliseconds. Let's see how this sounds. I think it should sound better. Let me play it for you here. Oops. Let me try that again because I have it bypassed still. One more time. Here we go. I think that sounds okay. It still sounds a little squished to me. I'm not sure if you can tell that or not, but I feel like there is a bit of an artificial sound to that. So I'm going to reduce my ratio a bit more. I'm going to bring it down to, I'm going to go down to 3-1, because I think the 4 where we were before, I think it's just, it was a little too harsh. Let me play it again. Yeah, I can deal with that. All right, let's play with another setting here. And this one is going to be the release. So remember, release says that, hey, after these many seconds, allow the sound to go back to its untampered state. I'm going to make my release really, really, really high, meaning the time is going to be so long that it's going to be subject to the compression longer than it should be. And take a listen to it and tell me if you can hear what's going on. I'll play it for you and I'll give you some comments about it. Here we go. And again, this is a bit more subtle, but what's happening is that the release I have it so high that the effects of the compression is hanging on way too long. So again, I think it kind of robs it of its natural sound. So if you have a very long release there, the compression will be in play for a lot longer. I don't need it to be in play for a lot longer because the sound kind of trails off naturally. I don't want, or the volume kind of goes down naturally. I don't need a compression to push that down when it's going to happen on its own.